The summer of 1985 was hot and dry in northern Arizona. The air shimmered over the long stretches of empty highway, and the sound of cicadas filled the quiet evenings. Officer Daniel Harris had been on the force for almost 15 years. He was one of those men who believed deeply in what he did, that wearing the badge meant protecting people, even when no one was watching. He lived in a small town on the edge of the desert with his wife, Linda, and their 9-year-old son, Michael. They had a modest home with a little porch where Daniel liked to sit in the evenings, drinking coffee after his shift. The town wasn't big, but everyone knew who he was. He had that calm, kind way about him, the kind of person who always waved to the neighbors and stopped to help if someone's car broke down on the side of the road. On the morning of July 14, 1985, Daniel woke up before sunrise. The sky was still a dark shade of blue, the stars fading one by one. He dressed quietly so he wouldn't wake Linda or Michael. He kissed his wife on the forehead, poured himself some black coffee, and looked at the family photo pinned to the refrigerator. It was from their trip to Lake Powell the year before. Michael was laughing, holding a fishing pole almost too big for him. Daniel smiled to himself and whispered, "See you tonight, buddy." It was supposed to be a normal day, just another long patrol shift along the winding canyon roads. But something about that morning felt a little off. Before he left, Daniel checked his patrol car like he always did: lights, radio, fuel. But he also tucked a small notebook into his uniform pocket, one that wasn't part of his usual gear. He'd been keeping quiet notes for a few weeks about a strange case he couldn't let go of. There had been reports of suspicious vehicles traveling through the canyon late at night, trucks with their plates covered, lights off. He suspected it was more than just reckless driving. The department told him to leave it alone. "You're chasing ghosts," his supervisor said. "There's nothing down there but rocks and snakes." Still, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had found tire marks off an old service road that didn't match any registered vehicles, and a month earlier, a small storage shed near the canyon was burned down before the police could investigate. Daniel believed someone was moving something, maybe drugs, maybe stolen goods, through those back roads, using the canyon as cover. That morning, he decided to take one last look on his own time. The sun was climbing higher now and the desert began to wake up. The air was already hot when Daniel turned onto Highway 89, the road that cut through the rocky hills and led to the canyon. He reported his location to dispatch, calm and routine as always. Unit 24 on patrol near Canyon Ridge, all clear. That was the last confirmed radio call anyone heard from him. Hours passed. Linda expected him home by evening. She made his favorite dinner, roast chicken with potatoes, and kept glancing out the window, waiting for his car to pull into the driveway. The clock ticked past 8 p.m., then 9. When midnight came and there was still no sign of him, she called the department. By dawn, search teams were out on the road. Helicopters scanned the canyon with spotlights. Officers combed through dirt trails and dry riverbeds. They found his patrol car near the edge of the canyon, parked on a dirt path that ended abruptly at a cliffside. The engine was still warm, the driver's door open. Inside were his notebook and coffee thermos. His radio crackled faintly, picking up static from nearby units. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away. It was as if Daniel had simply stepped out of his car and vanished into the desert. For days, the town held its breath. Volunteers joined the search, some hiking for miles through dangerous terrain. Reporters came from nearby cities asking questions the police couldn't answer. Was foul play suspected? Did Officer Harris run away? Could it have been an accident? But the canyon was unforgiving. Loose rocks, sharp drops, and deep crevices made it nearly impossible to cover every inch. After 2 weeks, the search was scaled back. By the third week, it was called off. Linda refused to believe he was gone. "He wouldn't just leave us," she told anyone who would listen. She visited the canyon every Sunday. Standing near the spot where his car was found, she'd bring Michael with her, even though he didn't like going there. The boy would hold her hand tightly, staring into the endless rocks and shadows below. Sometimes she'd whisper, "If you can hear me, Danny, come home." But no answer ever came. The case stayed open for a while, but there were no new leads. The department moved on, new officers came and went, and the file grew thin with dust. Linda eventually stopped getting updates. People in town stopped talking about it too. Some said he must have run into trouble and fallen into the canyon. Others whispered that maybe he found something he wasn't supposed to. Years turned into decades. The little boy who once waited by the window grew up carrying his father's absence like a shadow. Michael kept every clipping, every report, every photo of his father. He never forgot the sound of his mother crying in the kitchen that night, or the silence that filled their home after the search ended. He promised himself that one day he'd find out what really happened, even if no one else believed it mattered anymore. Back in 1985, though the mystery had only just begun, a week after the search ended, a hiker came forward with something strange. He said he saw lights down in the canyon the night Daniel disappeared, headlights that moved fast like someone was being chased. But when authorities checked, they found nothing. Still, that small piece of information made some of the officers uneasy. One of them, a friend of Daniel's named Officer Grant, quietly began asking around. He wanted to know if Daniel had been working on any side investigations. But soon after, he was told to stop. His reports were removed from the official files, and the chief told him the case was closed. Grant didn't argue, but he never forgot. Years later, he would tell Michael something that stuck with him forever. Your dad was looking into something big, bigger than anyone knew. But in the months after Daniel vanished, none of that was clear. All that remained were the questions. Linda sold their home a few years later and moved closer to her sister. She kept Daniel's badge in a small wooden box on her dresser, along with his wedding ring and a photo of him in uniform. Every Christmas she hung one special ornament, a tiny silver stars for him. Michael grew quieter as he got older. He didn't talk much about what happened, but he carried that memory with him into adulthood. The image of his father's empty car haunted him. Sometimes he'd dream of walking down that canyon road, calling out for his dad, hearing only the echo of his own voice in return. No one in the department ever found the courage to reopen the case. Over time, people forgot, but the canyon didn't forget. It kept its secrets buried under dust and rock, waiting for someone brave enough to look again. For 30 years, that place remained silent. Travelers passed through unaware of the story hidden beneath their tires. Locals warned people not to wander too close to the edges, saying the ground was unstable. But those who knew the story of Officer Harris always said the same thing, that sometimes, late at night, you could still hear the faint crackle of a police radio echoing from the canyon below. No one ever knew if it was true. But to Michael, growing up without answers, it didn't matter. He knew one thing for sure. His father didn't just disappear. Something happened that day in 1985, something no one had the courage to uncover. And one day, he would. 30 years had passed since the day Officer Daniel Harris vanished. The world had changed, but the canyon hadn't. It was still the same vast stretch of stone and silence, still keeping its secrets hidden from the people who once searched for him. Daniel's son, Michael, was now 39. He lived a quiet life in Flagstaff, working as a mechanic. He wasn't rich, but he was steady, reliable, the kind of man people trusted with their car keys and stories. Yet behind his calm voice and kind eyes, there was always something unsettled. He still thought about his father every single day. When his mother, Linda, passed away that spring, the memories came flooding back stronger than ever. She had never remarried. Even in her final years, she kept Daniel's picture on the nightstand beside her bed. At the funeral, Michael stood beside her casket and promised her that one day, he would find out what really happened to his father. After the funeral, Michael went back to his mother's old house to sort through her things. The house smelled faintly of lavender and dust, and everything was just as she had left it. The curtains drawn halfway, the family photo still hanging in the hallway. He opened every drawer carefully, trying not to stir up too many memories. In the back of her closet, he found a small wooden box, the same one that had always sat on her dresser. Inside was his father's badge, his wedding ring, and an old silver watch that no longer ticked. But at the bottom of the box, under a folded piece of fabric, there was something Michael had never seen before. A manila envelope with his name written on it in his mother's handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside were several old photographs, a faded map, and a letter. The letter was dated 1991. It read, "Michael, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. There are things about your father's case I could never say out loud. The police stopped searching too soon. But your father was looking into something before he disappeared. I found his notes, but I didn't know what to do with them. I've kept them safe all these years because I believe the truth is still out there. Maybe someday you'll be strong enough to find it." There was a short pause in her handwriting. Then one more line. "Don't let the canyon take both of you." Michael sat there for a long time, staring at the map. It was hand-drawn with old landmarks sketched in pencil. There was a faint X marked near a dried riverbed that cut through the canyon's lower half. Next to it, in his father's handwriting, were 3 words: "Something big here." His heart raced. He spent the next few nights going through his father's old notes that his mother had kept. There were pages filled with license plate numbers, dates, and descriptions of vehicles, mostly trucks, that had been spotted traveling late at night through the canyon. A few pages mentioned names of roads that didn't exist anymore, washed away by flash floods decades earlier. There were also references to a storage shed that had burned down before it could be searched, and mentions of a transport route being used for illegal shipments. Reading those pages, Michael realized his father had been right. He'd been chasing something real, and maybe that's why he never came home. He couldn't sleep after that. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face. He remembered that last morning, when his dad had tousled his hair before leaving for work, promising he'd be home by dinner. That promise had echoed in his mind for 30 years. The next week, Michael decided to go back to the canyon. He took time off work and gathered supplies, then water rope, a flashlight, and a drone he'd bought a year earlier for fun. He figured it would help him scan areas he couldn't reach on foot. He didn't tell anyone about his plan. It wasn't something he wanted to share. This was between him and the past. When he reached the canyon road where his father's patrol car had been found all those years ago, he parked his truck and stepped out. The air was hot and dry, the kind of heat that pressed down on your skin and made the rocks shimmer. He stood there for a while, staring into the wide emptiness below. The wind carried a faint whistling sound through the canyons, and the smell of dust filled his nose. He took a deep breath. "All right, Dad," he said quietly. "Let's see what you found." The trail down wasn't easy. The ground was uneven, and loose stones slipped under his boots as he walked. He followed the map closely, comparing it with modern GPS coordinates on his phone. Some of the paths drawn on his father's map didn't exist anymore, but the main landmarks were still there. A jagged rock formation that looked like a hand, a dry creek bed, and finally, a narrow ridge that led down to the lower part of the canyon. He set up the drone and sent it flying out over the area. On the small screen, he could see stretches of rock and sand, a few patches of desert shrubs, and the winding trail of the old riverbed. He moved the camera slowly, scanning every shadow. Then, just as he was about to pull it back, something caught his eye. There was a faint metallic glint deep down in the canyon floor, not bright enough to be new, but reflective enough to stand out against the dull stone. Michael zoomed in. For a moment, it looked like just another piece of scrap metal or debris, but the shape was too smooth, too symmetrical. It almost looked like part of a vehicle, the curved edge of a fender or door. His heart began to pound. He marked the spot on his GPS, then packed up his gear and started climbing down. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the bottom, the heat making every breath heavier. When he finally got close to the spot, he saw it with his own eyes. Half buried under layers of sand and rock was a large piece of rusted metal. He brushed away the dirt with his hands, his fingers scraping against something hard. It was paint, chipped, but still visible, blue and white. His throat tightened. Those were the exact colors of the Arizona Highway Patrol cars from the 1980s. He stepped back, his heart racing. He began to dig more, using a small shovel from his pack. Bit by bit, the outline of a crushed car began to appear. The roof bent inward, the windshield shattered, the wheels buried deep. Time had eaten away most of the metal, but there was no mistaking what it was. It was his father's patrol car. Michael stood there frozen, staring at it. After 30 years, the missing car that had sparked 1,000 questions was lying right there in front of him, hidden at the bottom of the canyon all along. He didn't know whether to cry or keep digging. His hands shook as he brushed away more dirt near the driver's side. Inside the mangled door frame, something small glinted in the light. He reached in carefully and pulled it out. It was a metal badge, dull from years of dust and rust. He turned it over and saw the engraved number, 1427. It was his father's badge number. Michael sat down beside the wreck, his breath shaky. He looked up at the sky in a clear, endless blue and whispered, "I found you." He stayed there for a long time, letting the moment sink in. He didn't find bones or clothes, just fragments of the car and the badge. Maybe the rest had been washed away over the years or buried too deep to find, but it didn't matter. He had proof now, proof that his father hadn't just walked away. Something had forced that car down here. When he climbed back up to the ridge, the sun was setting, painting the canyon gold and red. He looked down one last time before heading to his truck. The silence felt different now, heavier, but also peaceful. That night, back at his motel, Michael replayed the drone footage again and again. He noticed something he hadn't seen before. A few meters away from where the car was found, the drone had captured what looked like a faint tire track, newer than it should have been for a 30-year-old. Crash. It looked like someone else had been down there recently. Thought sent a chill through him. He saved the video to a flash drive and hid it inside his backpack. Whatever happened to his father, this was just the beginning. And somewhere deep down, he knew he wasn't the only one who had come looking for the truth in that canyon. The next morning, Michael packed up and drove straight to the local sheriff's office. He needed to tell someone, but as he would soon find out, some stories don't stay buried because people forget them. They stay buried because someone wants them to. The next morning, Michael woke up early. The room was still dim, and the sound of the ceiling fan filled the silence. For a few seconds, he didn't remember where he was. Then it hit him, in the canyon, the car, the badge. It hadn't been a dream. He sat up slowly, his body aching from the long climb the day before. The memory of standing beside the wreckage kept replaying in his mind. He could still feel the dry dust on his hands and see the faint gleam of his father's badge. He knew he couldn't keep what he'd found to himself. As much as he wanted to, this wasn't something that could stay hidden. He needed answers, and for that, he needed help. He packed the drone, the memory card, and the badge into his bag, then drove to the small sheriff's office in town. The building looked old and sun-faded, like most things around there. A flag flapped lazily outside in the morning breeze. Inside, the air was cool, and the walls were covered with old photographs of past sheriffs and deputies. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 50s wearing glasses and a warm but tired smile. She looked up when Michael walked in. "Morning," she said. "How can I help you?" "I need to speak with whoever's in charge," Michael replied. "It's about something I found in the canyon." Her smile faded a little. "What kind of something?" He hesitated, then said softly, "A car. A police car. It belonged to my father. He disappeared in 1985, the woman blinked. "You mean Officer Harris?" He nodded. Within minutes, a tall man wearing a tan uniform came out from the back. His badge said Sheriff Doyle. He had gray hair, sunburned skin, and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. "I heard what you said," the sheriff began, motioning for Michael to follow him into his office. "You're saying you found your father's patrol car?" "Yes," Michael said, setting his bag on the table. "I went down into the canyon. It's buried under rock and sand, but it's still there. I have footage." He handed over the drone's memory card. The sheriff plugged it into his computer and leaned closer as the video started playing. The images showed the canyon floor, the twisted metal of the old patrol car, and the spot where the badge had been found. When the video ended, the sheriff sat back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I was a rookie when your father disappeared. I remember that case. Nobody could figure out what happened. It's haunted this department for years." Michael looked at him closely. "Then maybe it's time to figure it out." The sheriff nodded slowly. "You're right. We'll send a team down there, officially." Over the next few days, investigators and forensic experts arrived. They closed off the road near the canyon and brought in equipment to carefully dig out the wreck. Michael stood at the edge, watching them work. He wasn't allowed too close, but he didn't mind. Just seeing people take it seriously meant more than he could say. After 2 days, they managed to pull most of the car from the ground. It was crushed nearly beyond recognition, but parts of the license plate were still visible, enough to confirm it was his father's vehicle. Inside, they found fragments of a uniform, a service revolver, and something else wedged between the seats, a small cassette recorder. The sheriff called Michael over. "We found this. It's old, but maybe it still works." Michael's breath caught when he saw it. His father had always carried a recorder to document notes during investigations. They took it back to the lab, cleaned it carefully, and managed to get part of the tape to play. The sound was rough, full of static, but a few words came through clearly. "Following a lead. Truck heading south. Something's not right. If anyone finds this..." Then there was a sharp noise like tires screeching, followed by silence. Everyone in the room went quiet. The sheriff looked at Michael. He was in pursuit of something. Michael nodded, his throat tight. He said he was looking into suspicious trucks. That's what his notes said. They spent the next week analyzing the tape and comparing old police records. It turned out that around the same time Daniel disappeared, there had been reports of smuggling in the area, stolen vehicles, illegal shipments, maybe even drugs. But those reports had mysteriously vanished from the archives. Someone had erased them. When Michael asked who might have done it, the sheriff hesitated. "Your father had enemies," he admitted. "Some inside the department didn't like that he kept digging into things. I remember there were rumors that he found proof of something he shouldn't have." Michael frowned. "You mean corruption?" The sheriff didn't answer directly. "Let's just say there were a few officers who left the force not long after your father went missing. 2 of them moved out of state. I never heard from them again." That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He sat outside his motel, staring up at the stars, his mind racing. If what the sheriff said was true, then his father hadn't just been a victim of an accident. Someone might have wanted him gone. But he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He just wanted the truth, the full truth. The next morning, the sheriff called him back to the office. "There's someone you should meet," he said. In the small meeting room sat an older man with a cane. His name was Officer Grant, one of the last people to see Daniel alive. "I served with your father," he said with a tired smile. "He was one of the good ones." "Never backed down?" Michael leaned forward. "Do you remember anything about his last case?" Grant hesitated. "I remember he was frustrated. He said someone high up was trying to shut him down. He didn't tell me who, but he mentioned something about a route through the canyon being used to move shipments. He wanted to prove it." Michael showed him the map his father had drawn. The old man's eyes widened. "This is it," he said softly. "That's the route he was talking about." Grant sighed and looked out the window. "I tried to help him back then, but when he went missing, they told me to stop asking questions. The chief said it was an accident, end of story, but I never believed that." Michael felt a mix of anger and sadness. "So they just buried it?" Grant nodded slowly. "Some things were easier to forget back then." Over the next few days, the story spread through town. News stations picked it up. Missing officer's car found after 30 years. People who had lived there in the 1980s started coming forward with memories, little details they'd never shared before. One man said he'd seen 2 unmarked cars parked near the canyon the night of the disappearance. Another claimed he'd heard a loud crash but was too scared to report it. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. But the more Michael learned, the clearer it became that this wasn't just an accident. His father had stumbled onto something big, and someone had made sure he never came back to tell the story. Still, Michael refused to let bitterness take over. When he stood at the canyon again, looking down at the place where his father's car had been, he felt something else, peace mixed with purpose. He whispered, "You didn't die for nothing." The sheriff's department continued its investigation, reopening the case officially after decades. They promised to dig deeper, to find whoever had been involved. For Michael, it was the first real sign of justice he'd ever seen. One evening, he sat alone with the cassette recorder. He pressed play again, listening to the faint sound of his father's voice through the static. "Not alone out here?" That line played over and over in his mind. Not alone. Michael looked up from the recorder. Maybe that meant his father had seen someone. Maybe even another car. He decided to check the drone footage again, frame by frame. Near the edge of one shot, he noticed something odd. A small, half-buried piece of metal just beyond the crash site. It looked like the corner of a license plate. He didn't say anything to the police yet. He wanted to see it for himself first. So the next morning, just as the sun rose, Michael returned to the canyon one more time. The air was cooler than before, and the shadows stretched long across the rocks. He climbed carefully down to the same spot where the wreck had been found. After searching for nearly an hour, he found it, the fragment of metal sticking out from the dirt. He brushed it off and turned it over in his hands. It wasn't part of his father's car. It belonged to another vehicle. He stared at it for a long time, realizing what that meant. His father hadn't crashed alone. Another car had been there, maybe chasing him, maybe forcing him off the road. The discovery made his heart pound. He took a photo of it, then packed it carefully into a small plastic bag. When he climbed back up, the sun was high, and the canyon seemed quieter than ever. He stood at the edge, looking out at the horizon, and whispered, "I'm getting closer, Dad." Somewhere deep down, he felt it. This was only the beginning of what his father had tried to uncover. The morning sun was just starting to light up the red cliffs when Michael drove back to town. The small piece of metal he'd found lay wrapped in a napkin on the seat beside him. He kept glancing at it as he drove, his thoughts racing. It was from another vehicle. That meant his father hadn't been alone when the crash happened. He didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but it felt big, bigger than anything they had uncovered so far. When he reached the sheriff's office, the same receptionist was there sipping her coffee. "Back again?" she asked, surprised. "Yeah," Michael said. "I think I found something new." A few minutes later, Sheriff Doyle met him in the office. His eyes widened slightly when Michael placed the metal fragment on his desk. "Where did you get this?" "Near where my father's car was," Michael said. "It's not from his patrol car. The paint's different, and it looks like a different model." The sheriff turned it over in his hands. "You're right," he said. "Looks like part of a fender. Maybe from a pickup truck or SUV. We'll send it to the lab and see if we can match it to anything." Michael nodded. "If that belongs to the car that hit him, maybe it'll finally tell us who was there that night." The sheriff gave a slow nod. "You keep surprising us, son. Your father would be proud." Those words hit Michael deep. For so long, he'd lived in the shadow of his father's disappearance, always wondering if he'd ever make him proud. Now maybe he was getting close to doing just that. A few days later, the results came back. The lab confirmed that the metal was from a 1980s model truck, specifically a dark green pickup that had been part of a small fleet once registered to a local construction company. The company had gone out of business in the late 1980s after being linked to several illegal operations: stolen parts, smuggling, and money laundering. The name of the company made the sheriff frown. "Your father was looking into this place," he said, pulling out an old report from the archives. "He mentioned their trucks a few times. It's possible one of their drivers was using the canyon route for something off the books." Michael leaned forward. "So he was right." "Seems like it," the sheriff said. "And if he caught them in the act—" He trailed off. They didn't need to finish the sentence. Michael took a deep breath. "Do we know who owned the company?" The sheriff looked at the paper again. Name was Thomas Gray. He passed away a few years back, but he had 2 sons. Both still live around here. Michael felt his heart tighten. "Do you think they might know something?" "It's possible," the sheriff said carefully. "But if we start asking questions now, they'll know we're looking. Let's do this quietly." The next few days were a blur of slow progress and restless nights. Michael tried to keep busy helping the investigators, revisiting his father's notes and comparing maps. Every line of his father's handwriting now carried new meaning. He could almost hear his voice through the words: steady, patient, always paying attention to detail. One night, Michael drove out to the canyon again. He parked near the ridge and sat on the hood of his truck, watching the sky fill with stars. The desert was silent except for the soft rustle of wind through the dry grass. He thought about all the years his mother had spent waiting, hoping for answers that never came. He thought about the people who had looked the other way, and how easy it had been for them to forget. But he couldn't forget. "Not now," he whispered. "I'm close, Dad. I promise I'll finish what you started." The next morning, the sheriff called with news. "You might want to come down here," he said. "We found something interesting." When Michael arrived, the sheriff handed him a folder. Inside were old internal reports, ones that hadn't been in the original case file. Somehow they'd been misplaced or removed years ago. The documents showed that his father had submitted several formal complaints about suspicious activity involving local businesses and certain officers. One of the names listed in those complaints matched a deputy who had left the force only a month after the disappearance, a man named Bill Rowan. Rowan moved to New Mexico in 1986, the sheriff said. We never heard from him again. But if anyone knows what really happened, it might be him. Michael stared at the papers. Can we find him? The sheriff nodded. We already did. He's retired now. Lives alone. I'll reach out to him. That call changed everything. When the sheriff got Rowan on the phone, the old deputy hesitated at first, but when he learned that Daniel's son was asking questions, something seemed to shift. He deserves to know, Rowan said quietly. I kept quiet for too long. The sheriff arranged a meeting for the following day. When Michael walked into the small diner where they were supposed to meet, he spotted Rowan sitting in the corner nursing a cup of coffee. He looked older than Michael expected, thin, gray-haired, with lines deepened by years of guilt and silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rowan looked up and said, You look just like your father. Michael swallowed hard. You knew him? I did, Rowan said softly, and I still regret not doing more. Michael sat across from him. Please, tell me what happened. Rowan stared at his coffee for a while before he began to speak. His voice was low and heavy. Your father was one of the best men I ever worked with. Honest, brave, and stubborn as a mule. When he started looking into those canyon routes, he found out they were being used to move stolen parts and cash. But what he didn't realize at first was that a few people inside the department were getting paid to look the other way. Michael felt his stomach turn. You mean officers? Rowan nodded slowly. Yeah, 2 of them were in on it. When your dad started asking too many questions, they tried to warn him off, but he wouldn't stop. The night he disappeared, he told me he had proof. Photos, license numbers, everything. He said he was going to hand it over the next morning. Michael clenched his fists. But he never made it home. No, Rowan said, his eyes filled with guilt. That night he called for backup near the canyon. I was supposed to go, but another unit got there first. The same 2 men he'd been investigating. That's when his radio went silent. The next day they said they found his car near the cliff and that he must have lost control. Michael shook his head slowly. They covered it up. Rowan nodded again. They made it look like an accident. I tried to tell someone, but nobody wanted to listen. And then before I knew it, the reports were gone and the whole thing was closed. I left soon after that. I couldn't stay. Silence filled the space between them. After a long pause, Rowan said, Your father wasn't wrong. He found something real, and he gave his life trying to protect others. You should be proud of him. Michael's voice was quiet. I always was. Rowan reached into his jacket and pulled out an old envelope. I kept this all these years. I think it belongs to you. Inside were a few black and white photos of trucks parked near the canyon and a handwritten note in Daniel's handwriting. It was dated the day before he disappeared. It said, I know who's behind it. If I don't make it back, tell my family the truth. Michael couldn't speak. He folded the note carefully and held it close, feeling the weight of everything his father had sacrificed. When he left the diner, the afternoon sun was starting to fade, painting the sky in soft gold. He stood by his truck for a while, breathing deeply. For the first time in decades, he finally knew what had happened. His father hadn't vanished because of bad luck. He'd been silenced for standing up for what was right, but now the truth was no longer buried. Back at the sheriff's office, Michael handed over the photos and the note. This needs to go in the official file, he said. The sheriff nodded firmly. It will, and I'll make sure this time no one buries it. In the weeks that followed, the story made headlines again. Not just about the discovery of the car, but about the corruption that had been hidden for so long. The old officers involved were gone, but their names were made public and Daniel Harris's name was cleared. The department held a small ceremony to honor him. His badge, once lost, was placed in a glass case at the station, along with a plaque that read, "For courage that time could not erase." Michael stood there quietly as people spoke about his father, not as a ghost from the past, but as a man who had done his duty no matter the cost. When the ceremony ended, he drove out to the canyon one last time. The air was cool and still, and the rocks glowed orange in the setting sun. He stood at the edge, looking down at the place that had held so many questions for so long. Now it felt different, peaceful, almost gentle. He held the note in his hand, then folded it back into his pocket. "You did it, Dad," he whispered. "And I found you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind rose softly through the canyon, carrying with it the faint sound of rustling leaves, like a quiet answer from somewhere far away. For the first time in his life, Michael felt the silence lift. The truth was finally free. The months after the ceremony brought a quiet kind of peace to Michael's life, but also a strange emptiness. For so long, everything had been about the search, finding the truth, uncovering what happened to his father, piecing together all the parts that had been buried for 30 years. Now that it was done, the silence felt different. He would wake up in the mornings and realize there was no canyon to drive to, no clues to chase, no old files to read. The weight of mystery was gone, but it left behind something he didn't expect. A hollow space. Like his life had revolved around the unanswered questions for so long that he didn't quite know what to do without them. Still, there was comfort in knowing his father's name had finally been cleared. The town saw Daniel Harris not as a man who'd vanished mysteriously, but as a good cop who stood up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. People began sharing stories. Old neighbors, retired officers, even shop owners who remembered how kind he'd been. One evening, Michael sat with his mother on the porch. The sun had set and the air smelled like rain. She looked older than before, but her eyes had a light that had been missing for decades. "You did it," she said softly. "You really found him?" Michael smiled faintly. "I just followed what he left behind." She reached over and took his hand. "Your father was always proud of you, even when you didn't know it. He used to say you had his stubborn streak." Michael laughed quietly. "Guess that finally paid off." They sat together in silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the wind moving through the trees. After a while, his mother said, "I think it's time to bring him home." The next day, with the sheriff's help, they arranged to recover the remains found near the canyon. The forensic team confirmed what Michael already knew. It was his father. They gave him a small wooden box with his father's badge and name engraved on it. Holding that box was harder than anything Michael had done so far. It was final. It meant there were no more searches to make, no more what-ifs. It was all real now. A week later, they held a small funeral at the town cemetery. Only a handful of people came. Family, a few old colleagues, and some locals who remembered the case. There were no long speeches, no music, just the sound of the wind moving gently across the grass. Michael stood at the front, looking down at the wooden box resting beside the headstone. The sheriff said a few words, something about courage, duty, and truth. But what stayed with Michael wasn't the words, it was the quiet. The kind of quiet that felt full, not empty. When everyone else left, Michael stayed behind. He sat on the bench near the grave until the sun dipped below the trees. He didn't cry. He just sat there thinking about all the years his father had been gone, and all the times he'd wondered where he was. Now he knew. That night, back home, he opened a small drawer in his father's old desk, the one that had been sitting in the corner of the living room for decades. Inside were a few of his father's old notebooks, worn and yellowed with time. As he flipped through them, he saw notes from old patrols, names of people his father had helped, small reminders of repairs to make, and even grocery lists. But one page caught his eye. It was written in his father's strong, neat handwriting. "Truth always finds its way home." Michael traced the words with his finger. It felt like a message meant for this very moment. He decided that night he wouldn't let his father's story fade again. The following month, a local journalist approached him, asking if she could write an article about Daniel's life. Not just the mystery, but the man behind it. At first, Michael wasn't sure. It was hard to imagine telling the world such personal things. But then he thought about how many people might be inspired by what his father had done. How he never gave up on doing the right thing, even when it cost him. So, he agreed. The story ran in the Sunday paper with the headline, "The Cop Who Never Stopped Seeking the Truth." It told everything, from his father's early days on the force to the night he disappeared, to Michael's discovery 30 years later. People from all over the state read it. Letters came in from strangers, other families who'd lost loved ones without answers, retired officers who said Daniel reminded them of why they joined the force in the first place. Michael read every letter. Some made him smile, others made him tear up. But they all shared one thing: gratitude. Gratitude for the courage of a man they'd never met, and for the son who refused to give up on him. With the help of the sheriff's office, Michael started a small foundation in his father's name. Its goal was to support the families of missing officers and help reopen cold cases. It wasn't much at first and just a few volunteers and a small budget, but the idea grew. People wanted to help. He called it the Harris Project. Soon it became more than he ever expected. Local departments began reaching out, sharing old cases. Families came to him for advice and sometimes just for hope. Every time he looked at the foundation's logo, a small silver badge with a light shining behind it, he thought of his father's badge, the one now safely displayed in the sheriff's office. One afternoon, about a year later, Michael got a call from a young man whose father had gone missing when he was a child. His voice shook as he asked how Michael had kept going all those years without giving up. Michael paused for a moment before answering. "You don't look for closure," he said. "You look for truth. The truth doesn't always heal you right away, but it gives you peace. And that's what keeps you going." When he hung up, he realized how much he had changed. The man who had once been lost in grief was now helping others find their way out of it. One day, the sheriff called him back to the station. "Got something for you," he said with a grin. He handed Michael a framed photo. It was of his father standing next to his patrol car, smiling, son behind him. Below it was a small plaque that read, "In memory of Officer Daniel Harris, a man who never stopped believing in what was right." Michael felt his throat tighten. "Thank you," he said quietly. The sheriff nodded. "No, son. Thank you. If it weren't for you, his story would still be buried out there." Michael stood there for a long moment looking at the photo. His father looked exactly how he wanted to remember him. Strong, calm, proud. That evening he drove out to the canyon again. The road was smoother now, newly paved, but the landscape hadn't changed much. The red cliffs still rose tall and quiet against the sky. He parked near the edge and sat on the hood of his truck, watching the sun set behind the rocks. The light turned everything gold, the same color as the day he'd first found the wreck. He thought about how strange life could be, how something lost for decades could suddenly come back to life, piece by piece, how truth could hide for years but still find its way home. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind. For a moment it felt like the canyon was breathing, alive with memories, with the stories of everyone who had passed through. Michael spoke softly, almost like a prayer. "I did what I promised, Dad. I found you, and I made sure they knew who you really were." The wind stirred again, warm and gentle, carrying with it a faint whisper that almost sounded like a voice answering him. A calm, peaceful voice that said, "Thank you, son." Michael opened his eyes and smiled. He didn't need to hear more. He already knew. As he drove back down the winding road, the stars began to appear one by one across the darkening sky. He felt lighter than he had in years. When he reached town, he passed the sheriff's office. The lights were off, but through the window he could see his father's badge glowing softly under the display light. He pulled over for a moment, just to look at it. Then he whispered, "You're home now." And with that, he started the engine and drove away, not chasing the past anymore, but moving toward the life that waited ahead.